So I'm delighted today to be joined by Stephen Humphreys. Now, we had the pleasure of meeting in Odessa for the Black Sea Forum. And whereas I came back to the UK to sort of edit up the interviews and footage, Stephen went on to Kyiv and experienced there and then back in Odessa. Pretty strong attacks by Russia. I'm going to get him to introduce himself and also to talk a little bit about that sort of experience because we see the escalation in Russian attacks happening on a near daily basis now. Before we do, I want to draw the audience's attention to the description of the video where you'll find details about our crowdfunder for 4x4 trucks for Ukraine. This is a fantastic Ukrainian charity that gets these essential pieces of kit over to the front lines where they help to save Ukrainian lives. And we've seen plenty of evidence that actually the ones that we've provided already have saved Ukrainians, not just their lives, but from debilitating injuries as well. It's incredibly worthwhile. Stephen, I'll let you jump in and explain a little bit more about yourself, your experience, and how you came to be in Ukraine.
Yeah, so I'm Stephen Humphreys. I'm an attorney in the U.S. coming to you now from Athens, Georgia, and I have spent at least probably over half my time since the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. So I've gone back and forth, I think, about 20 times. So it's interesting, Jonathan. So going back and forth, uh, get a chance to be away from the U.S. for a little bit and then come back and kind of gauge how the sentiment has changed while I was gone in Ukraine. And then this same thing when I go back to Ukraine, get a feel of, how things are maybe changing there. Of course, for my last visit, which was in end of May through mid-June, what is really clear, and I was also there in end of March and through middle of April. And it's very clearly escalating situation, even as some people are talking about Putin wanting peace and all that kind of stuff. I don't know what world they're living in because the attacks have escalated so much. In Odessa, it's very immediate because the Russians are attacking the port, which is right by the, main center of the city where, all the where the security conference was. And the main attack came after the security conference was over. Most people had left, but it just felt like, it was right outside your window. And but it's not unusual for the Russians to hammer Odessa. Then I went on to Kyiv, where every night we had massive drone strikes, and in particular, one night where it was just wave after wave after wave after wave of drones. I've been there for, lots of shooting and lots of anti-aircraft fire and lots of explosions of Patriots blowing up cruise missiles, and heard a lot of things over the 3 years that I've been there. But I had never really experienced a night like that where it was literally one wave came, and then as soon as that had passed or attacks been absorbed or shot down or whatever, then another wave came, and then another wave came, and then another wave came, and it was from midnight and continued past dawn. And there was some of the in the early days the Russians would fire lots of missiles and drones, particularly at Kyiv, and almost nothing would get through. Now they're changing their tactics, and they're overwhelming the defense systems, which are not as supported as they could be by some of Ukraine's allies. So more and more drones and missiles are actually striking. And then, of course, the other night, fortunately, I missed the other night when 15 people were killed, and including an American volunteer killed over there. And that's, I think, a new development. There are a lot of Americans that have been killed over there who volunteered to go fight at the front lines for Ukraine. And, I've been out at the front lines a lot, and even into Russia. And that, obviously is dangerous. But this was an American volunteer killed in Kyiv. And I don't think I've really heard the escalation of the issue from the American government that ought to be happening from that, just from that.
And of course, it happens at the same time as those sort of 20,000 components of air defense systems were diverted away from Ukraine to the Middle East. Of course, we didn't know at the time that the operation against Iran was pending, so it sort of makes a little bit more sense now. But it also shows a clear prioritization, doesn't it? You know, Israeli lives, they're the priority. Ukrainian lives, yeah,
Yeah, well, to say that this administration has not prioritized Ukraine would be the understatement of the 21st century.
we should have listened to J.D. Vance, I think, when he was a candidate in the previous election, and he basically went on camera saying, "Do you know what? I don't care about Ukraine's sovereign borders. I don't care about Ukraine. I don't care what happens to it." That was blatant. They've been perhaps a little less blatant in office, but essentially, when you dig into the actions, it's very much in line with those words that are captured on camera.
Yeah, it's just been one thing after another of not supporting Ukraine, from withdrawing the intelligence, from stopping the supply chain, to saying Ukraine started the war. Why'd they pick a fight with Russia? It just goes. The list is endless, and includes also the United States, shutting down its cyber operations related to Russia, and letting the Russians have free reign, pushing for poor Putin to get back into the G8 because his feelings were hurt, and all this talk about how there wouldn't have been a war if Russia had been in the G8. I think Putin is making it very clear that he doesn't adhere to or respect any of those statements by his escalating attacks,
And it's
and
extraordinary, isn't it, where
attacks on
those
civilians.
narratives are coming from. It is fascinating to actually hear them being said because, on the one hand, we can see Tucker Carlson saying kind of similar things. But we also see some extraordinary sort of, propaganda statements, and even some of the interviews of, say, Errol Musk, who was recently in Russia, unfortunately, for some kind of fascistic conference. And there's, my speciality is sort of I call it semantic parsing, looking at the patterns in language and repetition in language. And it does seem that there are various sources of information. It may be Trump's inner circle. He may be watching some of these key figures, like Errol Musk, like Tucker Carlson, and getting these narratives injected into his sort of informational world through these kind of sources.
One thing that was overlooked is, Trump and his pity party about how he and Putin have been through so much together. And then he references, the Russia hoax, which is not a hoax. Every law enforcement and intelligence agency, found that, one, that Russia was attacking the U.S. elections, going back to the 2016 election, and continues, and that the Trump campaign was uh, at least in a call and response mode with the Russians, and had a lot of cooperation and passed a lot of information directly to Russian intelligence. So you can't really say it's a hoax, but where it really went a bridge too far was where Trump said in that Oval Office meeting, poor Putin has gone through so much with me. We can argue, and Americans argue all about, how much Trump was involved with the Russians. But when Trump took the extra step and said, and Putin had nothing to do with it, that is maybe the most outrageous thing that was said in that whole meeting, because, every law enforcement and intelligence agency in the world agrees that Putin had, everything to do with those attacks on the U.S. elections. That's just a completely outrageous statement. That doesn't come from listening to Tucker Carlson. That's generated from Donald Trump's own uh, alternate reality.
His
And
enfeebled brain has conjured up some of those things. Um, So you've traveled widely. Of the things that you can kind of talk about, what are the kind of outcomes um, and research and outcomes that you've been able to achieve through these visits, and how are you communicating these experiences back to an American or international audience?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jonathan. I've been I feel like that's I do a lot of work with different Ukrainian uh, agencies through the government and military and everything, but I feel like my main role is to communicate to the American people to keep the support for Ukraine and to counter some of the disinformation. And I've tried to do that a lot of different ways. I've write op-eds in the newspapers. I make appearances. I go speak to groups. I spoke to the World Affairs Council. I just gave a talk about Ukraine at Princeton University. Um, and but also in my travels all over Ukraine, I've photographed, have a sideline as a professional photographer. And my previous work, it took me, for example, to Cuba all the time, and I went all over Cuba and did this documentary photography that's been an exhibition. So anyway, right now I have a exhibition of photographs from all over Ukraine that show both kind of the war devastation and also trying to show the resilience of the Ukrainian people as they, just try to live normal lives in these, kind of dire and unnecessary circumstances. And that exhibition originally opened, over a year ago at the University of Alabama, and it's traveled around some. It just showed in the Rada in the Ukrainian parliament, and we're trying to actually make arrangements for it to come to the UK parliament. That's in the works, and also to have it travel around to other cities in Europe and to college campuses in the United States. One, to show the photographs, people, see um, the images and what it brings home to people, but also to use those exhibitions as a forum to have speakers come in and do press conferences and do everything we can to try to get the word out. I've also, organized, delegations from Ukraine, from RADA deputies and also military officers to, come and have forums and speak directly to the American people. So anyway, there's a lot going on. And I tell people, even when I come home from Ukraine to the U.S., I'm still working on Ukraine issues. I'm trying to raise money for different groups, and also, holding all these, public events, and trying to educate American people about Ukraine and the importance of supporting Ukraine.
You've also been trying to hold various organizations to account. One of those, of course, is a very large sort of media outfit. Um, it is extraordinary, though, isn't it? The extent to which the media has not fully engaged with the Ukraine topic. Yes, there's been certain points where, attention has increased. The invasion of Kursk, or the special operation in Kursk, the initial invasion itself, then, of course, the Oval Office fiasco, Operation Spiderweb. There are these peaks in media attention. But between those, we don't tend to have the kind of scale of media that one would expect, especially if you compare it to something like sort of, Vietnam, the Gulf Wars, etc.
Yeah, that's true. Well, particularly after the October 7 Hamas attack, Ukraine just almost fell out of the news, at least in the United States. And fortunately, it's come back some now with both the attention on how everybody's still waiting to see how the war is going to be stopped in one day, and all of that rhetoric brought more attention to Ukraine, and then the Russian response, which is massive drone and missile strikes and deaths of civilians, has well, although that's all very unfortunate, it's fortunately bringing Ukraine back into the news some, and back into the, at least the American public consciousness, and we're trying to take advantage of that to try to get some kind of a just resolution and relief for the Ukrainian people, which does not include some of the things that the U.S. administration's negotiators have tried to float, like they tried to float the theory that Eastern Ukraine is really Russian, so it's okay if we give it to Russia, and that had to slam down very hard on that piece of disinformation that was coming from the U.S. Government, and the Eastern Ukraine is largely Russian speaking, but they're not Russians. They don't want to be part of Russia. They voted in 1991 to leave Russia. All of those um, parts of Ukraine joined overwhelmingly in the vote to leave the Soviet Union in 1991. And the Russian invasion hasn't increased their love of Russia, and and nobody wants to live. Um, you know, Not many people volunteer to live in a country where for example, the political opponent to the president is put in prison and murdered, and so uh, and it's interesting to see. The other thing I've noticed in Ukraine in my 3 years there is the backlash against speaking Russian. When I first went there, even in Kyiv, a lot of people would speak Russian. The language was kind of a Creole of Ukrainian with a lot of Russian words thrown in. But, for example, everybody, used to, for saying with the thank you would say spasiba, 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 and that has completely stopped. Everybody says yakua, and nobody, you can't find anybody who even says spasiba anymore. All that, Russian is just dropped out of the language. And there's nothing, Jonathan, that could be clearer. Putin invaded 3.5 years ago under the premise that, Ukraine was really part of Russia and that people would, welcome, the Russian soldiers, and, joyously, rejoin the great Russian Empire. Nothing could be clearer now after 3.5 years of Ukrainians fighting and dying by the thousands for that not to happen. Just couldn't, be any clearer that, Putin's whole premise is completely faulty, and he really just needs to turn around and go home. The whole thing is just a fiasco of his own making.
And you've also been working on a certain piece of investigation, which I think is quite interesting, and that is the treatment of Ukrainian sort of film crews, journalistic sort of talent who have ostensibly been let down by a Western media organization. Could you describe a little bit of what's going on with that case and why you feel it's so important?
Yes. So I actually a little over a year ago filed a lawsuit in New York against Fox News, and the basic fact scenario was that uh, uh, early on, after the full-scale invasion, up near in Hostomel near Irpin, up northwest of Kyiv, where the Russians were attacking and where they actually occupied that territory for about 6 weeks around Irpin and Bucha. Bucha, of course, became infamous for the war crimes that were committed there when the Russians left, all the, rapes and murders and torture that, people found left behind were uh, truly insidious. But that was happened also in the nearby areas of Irpin and everywhere. But anyway, in March of 2022, um, Fox News crew was struck by some kind of fire right on the uh, border of Irpin, and a Ukrainian 24-year-old Ukrainian woman named Sasha Kuvshanova, who Fox had sort of hired, although they had never really formalized any agreement. But anyway, she was working for them as a translator. She was killed, and also Pierre Zachevsky, who was a longtime Fox cameraman, and basically both of them were basically functioning as the producers for Fox. Fox had taken its producers out of Kyiv and sent them to Lviv and out of the country because it was too dangerous, and then left these other people behind to try to run the news organization there. Anyway, the place they were killed, on the border of Irpin, we've identified 7 different levels of warnings that Fox had not to go there, including from their own security advisors who they hired, who said, you can't go there. Um, and They were trying to go out into that area because, as a lot of people will remember the very iconic footage at the beginning of the invasion from the bridge at Irpin, all the refugees crossing the river on a plank, and that was very famous footage. It's actually one of the things that inspired me when I saw it to come to Ukraine and volunteer and try to help out. Anyway, Fox was trying to recapture that kind of story, um, really 2 weeks too late, when the Russians had taken over most of that area, and they went out there in spite of all the warnings, and very predictably were struck, and those 2 members of the crew were killed. Ben Hall, the lead reporter for Fox, was very seriously injured, and was really miraculously saved, brought back to the United States, went through all kinds of treatment. He came out, and he still works for Fox. He came out with a book a year later called Saved. It's mostly about his recovery, which is an inspiring story, but there's one chapter in the book about what allegedly happened that day, according to Fox News, in which we allege in our lawsuit is all completely false, and that what Fox was doing was, trying to cover up uh, the the recklessness of going out there uh, after ignoring all the warnings not to go out there. And they actually went out there without their security advisor, which is um, I won't opine about it. You could find a lot of people in the media industry who would, comment on the advisability of a news crew, especially one operating without actual producers, to go out into a hot war zone and actually leave the person who's supposed to advise them on security behind. Um, anyway, so I've filed a lawsuit on behalf of the parents of Sasha Kuvshinova, based on what we found out. Anyway, Ben Hall in his book claimed that when they went out there, they thought the Russians were 30 miles away. Uh, Again, I'll leave it to the actual evidence of where everybody knew the Russians were. The Russians were occupying Irpin, and the crew was hit on the border of Irpin. So, you can do the math and determine whether they could have been 30 miles away. Um, and After we filed our lawsuit, the widow of Pierre Zachevsky, based on what our investigation and what we've been able to uncover, also filed a similar lawsuit in the UK against Fox for getting her husband killed out there. And also, she uh, very famously and very actively was trying to find out what had happened. There was actually a story in the Washington Post about her efforts to try to find out, how did this happen? How did the crew end up out there in such a dangerous place? And according to her in the Washington Post, Fox was not forthcoming with with answers. Anyway, our investigation determined a lot about what happened, and as I said, uh, after our discovery, she also has filed a lawsuit against Fox.
And of course, that we can't go into too much detail there because that will be the subject of a court case. We don't want to sort of prejudice any of that detail. But does it highlight a wider issue of I wouldn't call it media contempt, but perhaps sort of not adhering to best practice in somewhere like Ukraine? Um, not necessarily giving due recognition to local talent as well.
Yeah, well, to me that's an issue. Um, the media reporters and some of the news agencies actually have very impressive information gathering operations, and their process to determine where they go and whether it's safe to go there is actually quite impressive, and relies on their own security people they hire, and they also are very connected to the uh, Ukrainian military, U.S. intelligence, all kinds of resources they use to try to determine where they can go and get a story, and where it's safe to do that. So that does happen, but obviously the people who come in from Washington, D.C. don't don't know the area of Ukraine. They don't understand where what Irpin is, where it is, where's Hostomel, all these places, and so they rely heavily on these local guides they call fixers, which I don't like the term. It's kind of pejorative. The fixers really, and this happened in the case of Sasha Kuvshinova, especially since Fox took its producers out because it was too dangerous. And really, Sasha Kuvshinova became the producer for Fox News operations as a 24-year-old Ukrainian woman with, obviously no, she's in her own country, but other than that, no experience with, war zones or military operations or, security issues. In this particular case, there was, way too much reliance on the local person and not enough credit. Like I said, she didn't really have any kind of formal employment arrangement. That's all been kind of hashed out, after she was killed.
With extensive travel, I mean, some Ukrainians I know still describe deeply hurtful incidents, in Europe where people simply say, "Oh, is there a war going on?" I mean, one even a very well dressed lady, an artist, apparently in Germany, um, someone in uniform asked her that question, and then when she said, she's heading to Ukraine, he said, "Oh, well, there can't be a war on, if you're dressed like that, etc., etc." It does seem extraordinary, though, doesn't it? We were in Odessa. I was in Kyiv in January. It once you're there, before you go, you mentally think it's a very, very long way away, but actually it really isn't. And that was brought home to us in January when we drove over from the UK, and it sort of took 2 days. But geographically, when you're on the ground, you're not jumping an aeroplane. You realize that really this is not far, and these are Europeans in a European city on the European continent. Um, Mentally, we almost sort of mentally we cut it off as if it's somewhere extremely far away, happening to people of whom we know nothing. But actually, Russia has invaded the European continent. This is just the bleeding edge of what could be a far, far wider invasion, one which Ukraine probably has, for the moment at least, thwarted Putin in. That's not to say the intent isn't there.
Yeah, according to Putin's own rhetoric, it's a war against NATO, and if Ukraine had not been able to stop Russia, they'd be, if you believe what they say, moving into Poland and Estonia and Lithuania and Latvia. And you talk about the war being far away. The people in those countries, believe me, do not feel as far away. You get on the border of Poland, and you're aware um, of the juggernaut that's waiting on the other side. And really, the Ukrainians have done the rest of Europe and the whole world a service um, by stopping uh, Putin where they did at great sacrifice, and the world should appreciate it, and never give up its support for Ukraine, and as you said, never let it even fade out of the news. while it's fading out of the news, people are still being killed in Ukraine, including civilians and American volunteers, just not even part of the fighting.
And it seems intelligence assessments, which actually proved to be, broadly speaking, spot on from 2021 onwards when they predicted full-scale invasion. Um, those same intelligence analysts, we had incredibly strong statement from the German intelligence agency. We've had very strong analysis and statements from former and current British intelligence heads basically saying what we've just discussed here, which Russia has the intent to take this far wider, whether it's kinetic war on the ground, whether it's through sabotage, interference, and so on. Russia considers itself war with the West. So it seems there are those in our intelligence services that get it. Do you detect that our governments are really taking those messages to heart despite the rhetoric? Because we seem not to be reacting as if that threat were real.
Um, that's a very true statement. Europe has showed some signs of waking up. The American government has fallen farther asleep and living in total denial. And I think the more importantly, the American public is not aware as they should be, and really no administration has done the job. Going back to Obama when Crimea was first seized by the Russians, I think failed to make it clear to the American people that the Russians consider themselves at war with us. So we're in this war that they know they're in the war. We don't even know we're in the war, and on top of the obvious actual fighting in Ukraine and the constant threats to the Baltic states and Finland and everything else that if you watch Russian TV, they a regular feature is a mock-up of a nuclear attack on Washington D.C. I mean, the level of the rhetoric is just insane. So they know they're at war with us. We don't know it, and it helps them to conduct all these cyber operations in the United States, which did not stop with the 2016 election. People were Russians and Americans were indicted for espionage operations directed against U.S. elections last year here in the state of Georgia, where I'm sitting, and people really have no awareness that that's going on. And now, with the new administration, really all of the uh, law enforcement and intelligence operations to protect the United States have really fallen by the wayside. It's an incredibly dangerous situation.
There was some ironic kind of, I think, sort of hand-wringing on, I think it was Solovyov's show, or one of the propagandists, where he was bemoaning the fact that Trump seems to be falling out with some of their favorite people, or those that are most commonly reproducing Russian propaganda narratives, Tulsi Gabbard, Elon Musk. I think there's a certain nervousness that Trump may be something of an unstable asset because he's taking out some of these voices who are quite strongly parroting Russian propaganda, but inadvertently. And I don't think that's the reason he's taken them out. It's just his sheer sort of narcissistic chaos.
Yeah, this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, but uh, people keep operating as if we're in some kind of normal world, which we're clearly not.
What's your plans then for the coming months in Ukraine? You've mentioned sort of photo exhibition trying to push. What's going to be the focus of your upcoming trips and activism?
Well, the focus of the photo exhibition that'll be traveling in the U.S. and Europe is to focus on the war crimes and really focus people's attention on just the incredible nefarious acts of the Russians. And there's so many incredible war crimes that are really not in the public consciousness. Just incredible things like Ukrainian symphony conductor who was murdered because he refused to play for the Russians when they occupied his city. Um, the huge issue is the Ukrainian children who have been abducted and taken into Russia and said, "Hey, these are your new Russian parents," and an incredible, insidious war crime. But people don't pay enough attention to in addition to the tens of thousands of children that have been abducted in that fashion. Um, all of the children in the territories occupied by Russia are experiencing this, giant brainwashing where the, Russians have changed all the schools, all the, textbooks, everything. They're, all these, approximately 1 million children being taught to be Russians and taught that Ukraine doesn't really exist, and those Ukrainians over there on the other side are Nazis. That people don't understand the dangerous situation that Ukrainians living in occupied territories experience. They all have friends and family back in unoccupied Ukraine who they don't dare contact because they'll, quickly, receive a visit from the FSB if they're in, contact with Ukrainians on the other side. It's just an intolerable situation. And so to me, that's the main point. When all this talk about let's have some kind of negotiated settlement, um, there seemed to be a lot of acceptance of, well, let's just like maybe keep the line where it is and let the Russians keep what they've taken. And you just have to understand what that does to the Ukrainian people and the actual danger they're in, and people experiencing arrests and tortures and murders, and but just a complete suppression of their Ukrainian identity and their, like I said, the ability to even, be in contact with their friends and relatives that they obviously have, in other parts of Ukraine. So that's, I think, very important to highlight. And legally, we're going to be working heavily on legal action. You never forget I primarily came to Ukraine as an attorney to work on war crimes issues, and so we'll be stay tuned for another episode because we have a lot of plans in the works for legal action against the Russians.
Well, I wish you luck with that. That's incredibly worthwhile. I'll be speaking next week to Olga Matviechuk about the same kind of topic, the abduction of children, the war crimes, the terrible acts, and we'll be, putting some individual names and faces to those stories as well in that conversation. It was fascinating meeting you in Odessa. It's been fascinating talking again today. I hope the audience enjoy it as much as I have, or find it as informative,
Yeah,
let's
I
say.
appreciate it,
Uh,
Jonathan. I look forward to talking to you again soon. I'll catch up with you in the UK or Ukraine somewhere soon, I hope.
I hope so. Yeah, well, stay safe and thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you, Jonathan.